My name is Daniel Carter. I live in a quiet neighborhood in Portland, Oregon. But the story I'm about to tell you didn't start here. It started across the border in Vancouver, Canada, in a small white house at the end of Maple Street. This story is about a grandmother everyone thought was weak, a grandmother everyone believed had nothing left to give. But they were wrong, because sometimes the strongest person in a family is the one everyone stops listening to. And sometimes, the smallest voice in the house tells the biggest truth. Before we begin, if you enjoy emotional stories like this, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves heartfelt stories. Your support keeps these stories alive. Now, let me tell you about Margaret Thompson. Margaret Thompson was 74 years old. Her hair had turned silver years ago, and her hands trembled slightly whenever she held a cup of tea. But her eyes still carried the warmth of a woman who had spent her entire life loving people more than herself. She lived alone in that small house on Maple Street. Well, not completely alone. Every afternoon a little boy would run through her front door shouting, "Grandma, I'm here!" His name was Ethan Walker. He was 10 years old, and he was Margaret's grandson. To Margaret, Ethan wasn't just family, he was her whole world. But Ethan wasn't like other kids. While children his age ran around playing soccer and riding bicycles, Ethan spent most of his time sitting quietly on the couch with a blanket around his shoulders. His skin looked pale, his breathing was often slow and heavy, and some days he barely had the strength to smile. Doctors had a name for it. A complicated name, autoimmune disorder. His body was fighting itself, and every year, he grew weaker. Ethan's parents were busy people. His father, Michael Walker, worked long hours as a construction manager. His mother, Jessica Walker, ran a successful real estate business. They loved Ethan, but their lives were always moving. Meetings, phone calls, deadlines. They believed the doctors, they trusted the hospitals, and they assumed everything was under control. But Margaret wasn't so sure. Every day when Ethan came to her house after school, Margaret noticed things others ignored. How he barely touched his food, how his hands shook when he tried to hold a spoon, how sometimes his eyes looked tired in a way no child's eyes should. One afternoon, while Ethan sat quietly drawing pictures at the kitchen table, Margaret asked gently, "Sweetheart, did you eat lunch today?" Ethan shrugged. "Not really." Margaret frowned. "Why not?" The boy hesitated. Then he whispered something that made Margaret's heart tighten. "It hurts when I eat." Margaret froze. "What hurts, honey?" "My stomach." That night, Margaret called her son, Michael. "Michael," she said softly, "I think Ethan's condition is getting worse." Michael sighed through the phone. "Mom, the doctor said it's normal. They're monitoring him." "But he's not eating," Margaret insisted. "They said his appetite might change." Margaret looked at Ethan sleeping on the couch beside her. His breathing was shallow, uneven. "Michael, I just have a bad feeling." There was a pause. Then Michael replied gently but firmly, "Mum, you worry too much." Margaret hung up the phone slowly. She had heard that sentence many times before. You worry too much, but mothers and grandmothers often feel things others don't. And Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Over the next few weeks, Ethan became weaker. Some days he didn't even have the energy to walk to the kitchen. Margaret began cooking soft soups and warm oatmeal, hoping it would help. One evening, as rain tapped against the windows, Ethan looked up at her with tired eyes. "Grandma?" "Yes, sweetheart." "Do you think I'm going to die?" The spoon fell from Margaret's hand. "Why would you say that?" Ethan stared at the floor. "Because Mom and Dad whisper about hospitals a lot, and doctors look sad when they see me." Margaret's chest tightened. She walked over and wrapped her arms around him. "You're not going anywhere.
she said firmly. "I promise." But deep inside, she wasn't sure. A week later, something happened that changed everything. Margaret had just finished baking apple pie when Ethan suddenly collapsed in the living room. "Ethan!" she shouted. His small body trembled. His face had turned almost white. Margaret grabbed the phone and dialed emergency services with shaking hands. Within minutes, paramedics rushed into the house. Sirens echoed down Maple Street. Neighbors peeked through their windows, and Margaret stood frozen at the door as they carried Ethan away on a stretcher. At the hospital in Vancouver General, doctors ran test after test. Hours passed. Michael and Jessica arrived, their faces pale with worry. "Where is he?" Jessica asked breathlessly. "In the ICU," Margaret said quietly.
Jessica nodded stiffly, but didn't look at her. For years, Jessica had believed Margaret interfered too much. Too many questions, too many concerns. And now, she blamed the old woman for panicking. But what none of them knew yet was that Ethan himself held a secret that would soon break the entire family apart. Late that night, Margaret was allowed to see Ethan. He looked tiny in the hospital bed. Machines beeped softly beside him. Margaret held his small hand. "Grandma," he whispered. "I'm here, sweetheart." Ethan looked around to make sure no one else was listening. Then he said something so quietly, Margaret almost didn't hear it. "Grandma, I didn't get sick by accident." Margaret frowned. "What do you mean?" Ethan swallowed slowly. Then he whispered the words that made Margaret's blood run cold. "Someone is making me sick." Margaret's heart pounded. "What do you mean, Ethan?" The boy's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't want to tell anyone, because they said not to." "Who said that?" Margaret asked, her voice shaking. Ethan looked toward the hospital door, as if someone might be standing there, watching. Then he whispered one name. And when Margaret heard it, she felt the ground disappear beneath her feet, because the person Ethan had just named was someone the family trusted completely. If this story touched your heart so far, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes grandmothers are the true heroes of families. Because the truth Ethan had just revealed was about to destroy everything, and what Margaret would do next would shock the entire family. Margaret Thompson sat beside Ethan's bed, her hand wrapped gently around his fragile fingers. The machines beside him hummed quietly, and the faint beeping of the heart monitor echoed through the room. But Margaret barely heard any of it, because the name Ethan had whispered was still ringing inside her mind. Her voice trembled. "Ethan, sweetheart, are you sure?" The little boy nodded weakly. Tears gathered in his eyes. "They told me not to tell anyone. Grandma." Margaret leaned closer. "Who told you that?" Ethan swallowed slowly, his lips dry. Then he whispered again. "Aunt Rebecca." Margaret's heart nearly stopped. Rebecca Walker, Michael's younger sister, Ethan's favorite aunt. Rebecca was 38 years old. She lived just 2 streets away from Margaret's house and visited the family often. Rebecca was cheerful, charming, and always brought gifts for Ethan. Toys, candy, video games. Everyone loved her, especially Ethan. That's why Margaret felt a strange chill run through her body. "Ethan," she said gently, "why do you think Aunt Rebecca made you sick?" Ethan hesitated. "She gives me medicine sometimes." Margaret frowned. "What kind of medicine?" "I don't know. She says it helps my stomach." Margaret's stomach twisted. "Does she give it to you when your parents are around?" Ethan shook his head slowly. "No, only when they're busy." Margaret stood up slowly. Her legs felt weak. Her mind raced with questions. Could Ethan be confused? Could a child misunderstand something like this? Rebecca had always seemed kind, helpful, loving.
But Margaret knew something about people that others often ignored. Sometimes the sweetest smiles hide the darkest intentions. Just then, the hospital door opened. Michael and Jessica walked in. Jessica rushed to Ethan's side immediately. "Oh, baby," she whispered, brushing his hair back. "You scared us." Michael looked exhausted. He placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder. "How is he?" Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it again. Ethan's secret burned in her chest, but accusing someone without proof could destroy the entire family. Still, she couldn't stay silent. "Michael," she said quietly, "we need to talk." They stepped into the hallway. The fluorescent lights above flickered softly. Michael crossed his arms. "What's wrong?" Margaret hesitated. Then she spoke. "Ethan told me something." Michael frowned. "What?" Margaret looked directly into his eyes. "He thinks someone has been giving him medicine." Michael blinked. "Well, of course, he takes medicine all the time." "No," Margaret said firmly. "Medicine we don't know about." Michael's expression changed. "What are you saying?" Margaret took a deep breath. "He said Rebecca gives it to him." For a moment, Michael simply stared at her. Then he laughed, a short, nervous laugh. "Mom, that's ridiculous." Margaret didn't smile. "I'm serious." Michael shook his head. "Rebecca loves Ethan. She would never hurt him." "That's what I thought too," Margaret replied quietly. "But Ethan sounded scared." Michael rubbed his forehead. "He's a sick kid, Mom. Kids imagine things." Margaret felt frustration rise in her chest. "Michael, I know my grandson. That boy wasn't imagining anything." Michael sighed heavily. "I'll talk to Rebecca." But Margaret knew that tone. It was the same one he used years ago when he didn't want to believe something.
Later that night, Rebecca arrived at the hospital. She rushed into Ethan's room with wide, worried eyes. "Oh my God, Ethan," she cried, hugging him gently. "I heard what happened." Jessica stood beside her. "Thank goodness you came, Rebecca." Rebecca looked at Ethan. "You gave us quite a scare, little guy." Ethan's body stiffened slightly. Margaret noticed immediately. The boy avoided Rebecca's eyes. That small moment made Margaret's heart pound harder. Rebecca turned to Margaret. "How are you holding up, Margaret?" Her voice was warm, friendly, but Margaret watched her carefully. "I'm fine," Rebecca smiled. "You always take such good care of Ethan. He's lucky to have you." Margaret forced a small smile, but inside, her instincts screamed. Something wasn't right. The doctor entered the room soon after. He cleared his throat. "We've reviewed Ethan's test results." Jessica leaned forward anxiously. "What did you find?" The doctor looked puzzled. "That's the strange part." Everyone waited. "We found traces of a substance in Ethan's bloodstream." Margaret's heart began to race. Jessica's eyes widened. "What kind of substance?" The doctor looked down at his tablet. "A chemical compound that can cause stomach pain, fatigue, and immune reactions." Michael frowned. Where would he get something like that? The doctor shook his head slowly. "It's not something children normally encounter." Margaret felt the room spin slightly, because Ethan's whisper echoed in her mind again. "Someone is making me sick." Rebecca suddenly spoke. "Well, maybe it came from food or something." The doctor shrugged. "It's possible." But Margaret noticed something strange. Rebecca's smile had faded. Her fingers tapped nervously against her purse. And for a brief moment, their eyes met. Rebecca looked away quickly. Later that night, everyone went home except Margaret. She refused to leave Ethan alone. The hospital lights dimmed as midnight approached. Ethan slept quietly. Margaret sat beside him, thinking. Every memory of Rebecca replayed in her mind. The visits, the gifts, the private moments with Ethan. Had she missed something? Had she ignored warning signs? Suddenly Ethan stirred. "Grandma, I'm here." The boy looked worried. Did you tell them? Margaret hesitated. Yes. Ethan looked toward the door nervously. She'll be angry. Margaret stroked his hair. No one is going to hurt you again. But deep down, she knew something terrible was coming, because if Rebecca really was responsible, the truth would tear the family apart. The next morning, Margaret arrived at Ethan's house to collect some of his belongings. Jessica had asked her to bring clothes and his favorite blanket. The house felt quiet, almost too quiet. Margaret walked into the kitchen slowly. Then she noticed something strange. On the counter was a small bottle, a medicine bottle she had never seen before. Margaret picked it up. There was no label, just clear liquid inside. Her heart began pounding again, because she suddenly remembered something Ethan had said. Aunt Rebecca gives me medicine sometimes. Margaret held the bottle tightly. And in that moment, she realized something horrifying. This might be the proof she needed. But she didn't know yet that someone was standing behind her, watching. Margaret Thompson froze. The small glass bottle trembled slightly in her wrinkled hand as a quiet voice suddenly spoke behind her. Well, that's interesting. Margaret slowly turned around. Standing in the doorway of the kitchen was Rebecca Walker. Her arms were folded, and a strange smile rested on her face. Margaret's heart pounded loudly in her chest. Rebecca stepped forward casually, her heels clicking against the wooden floor. I didn't expect to see you here so early, Margaret. Margaret tightened her grip on the bottle. I came to collect Ethan's things from the hospital. Rebecca's eyes moved down toward the bottle. Then she chuckled softly. And you decided to snoop around too? Margaret felt anger rising inside her. I wasn't snooping. Rebecca tilted her head. Then why are you holding that? Margaret raised the bottle slightly. What is this, Rebecca? For a brief moment, Rebecca didn't answer. Instead, she walked slowly to the kitchen counter and poured herself a glass of water. Her calmness made Margaret even more uneasy. Finally, Rebecca sighed. Just some vitamins. Margaret's voice sharpened. Vitamins don't come in unlabeled bottles. Rebecca smiled again. You always were suspicious of everything. Margaret stepped closer. Ethan told me something. Rebecca's expression froze for a split second, but then she laughed. Oh, really? Margaret looked directly into her eyes. He said you've been giving him medicine. Rebecca shrugged casually. So what? Margaret's breath caught. So what? He's sick. Rebecca leaned against the counter. Yes, he is. Margaret stared at her. You've been poisoning him. Rebecca's smile slowly faded. The room grew quiet. Then Rebecca whispered something chilling. Not poisoning, she stepped closer. Just helping. Margaret felt her stomach twist. Helping him get worse? She asked angrily. Rebecca's eyes darkened. You wouldn't understand. Margaret's voice shook. Then explain it to me. Rebecca's calm mask finally cracked. Her face hardened. Fine. She walked toward the window and stared outside. You want the truth? Margaret nodded slowly. Rebecca turned back toward her. It started 2 years ago. Her voice was cold now, flat. Do you remember when Ethan first got sick? Margaret did remember. The mysterious stomach pains, the constant fatigue, the endless doctor visits. Yes, she said quietly. Rebecca's lips curled slightly. That's when I realized something. Margaret's heart pounded harder. What? Rebecca looked directly at her. People care more when something is wrong. Margaret blinked. What are you talking about? Rebecca laughed softly. For years, I was invisible in this family. Her voice grew bitter. Michael had the perfect career. Jessica had the perfect life. And Ethan... She paused. Ethan was the perfect child. Margaret whispered. So you made him sick? Rebecca's eyes filled with strange emotion. At first, It was small things. Margaret felt her knees weaken. A little chemical here, a little there. Tears filled Margaret's eyes. "You're insane," Rebecca shrugged. No one noticed. The doctors called it an illness. The family became closer. Her voice softened. "They finally needed me." Margaret stared at her in horror. "You nearly killed him." Rebecca's face twisted. "I never wanted him to die," Margaret shouted. "Then why keep doing it?" Rebecca slammed her hand on the counter. "Because they stopped paying attention again." The words echoed through the house. Rebecca's breathing grew heavy. "Every time Ethan got worse, they came back to me. They asked for help. They trusted me." Margaret whispered. "You're sick." Rebecca smiled faintly. "Maybe." Margaret looked down at the bottle in her hand. "So this is what you've been giving him?" Rebecca nodded slowly. "Just enough to keep him weak." Margaret felt rage burning inside her. "You monster!" Rebecca's voice turned cold again. "You should put that bottle down." Margaret shook her head. "No." Rebecca's eyes narrowed. "Give it to me." Margaret stepped back. "I'm taking this to the police." Rebecca's expression changed instantly. The calm woman was gone. In her place stood someone desperate. "You can't do that." "Yes, I can." Rebecca walked forward slowly. "Margaret, think carefully." Margaret's voice trembled but remained firm. "You've hurt my grandson," Rebecca whispered, "and you're about to destroy your son's family." Margaret froze. Rebecca continued softly. "Imagine the headlines. A woman poisoning her own nephew. Michael's reputation would collapse. Jessica's business would suffer." Margaret's heart pounded. Rebecca leaned closer. "Is that what you want?" Margaret whispered. "I want Ethan safe." Rebecca's voice turned icy. "Then give me the bottle." Margaret shook her head. "No." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Rebecca suddenly lunged forward. She grabbed Margaret's wrist. The bottle slipped from Margaret's hand and crashed onto the floor. Glass shattered everywhere. The clear liquid spilled across the tiles. Margaret gasped. "Rebecca!" Rebecca stared at the broken glass, her face drained of color. "No, no, no." Margaret quickly pulled her phone from her pocket. "I'm calling the police." Rebecca's head snapped up. Panic filled her eyes. "You wouldn't dare." Margaret pressed the emergency number. "Yes," she said firmly. "I would." Rebecca suddenly ran toward the door. Within seconds, she was gone. The front door slammed. Margaret stood there trembling. The shattered bottle lay on the floor like silent evidence of a nightmare. 2 hours later, police officers arrived. Margaret told them everything. Ethan's whispers, Rebecca's confession, the strange bottle. The officers took notes carefully. One of them looked at Margaret seriously. "If what you're saying is true," he paused, "this is a very serious crime." Margaret nodded. "I know." But inside, her heart still felt heavy, because this wasn't just a crime. It was a betrayal that could destroy the entire family. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Ethan opened his eyes slowly. Michael sat beside him. "Hey, buddy," Ethan whispered. "Dad?" Michael smiled weakly. "You're going to be okay." But Ethan looked worried. "Did Grandma tell you?" Michael hesitated. Then he nodded. "Yes." Ethan swallowed nervously. "Are you mad?" Michael shook his head and hugged him gently. "No. I'm proud of you." Ethan's voice trembled. "Is Aunt Rebecca in trouble?" Michael looked down. "Maybe." Ethan closed his eyes. "I didn't want anyone to fight." Michael whispered softly. "Sometimes telling the truth causes fights." He squeezed Ethan's hand. "But it also saves lives." Across the city, Rebecca sat alone in her car. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel. Police sirens echoed faintly in the distance. Tears rolled down her face. She whispered to herself, "I never meant for it to go this far." But deep down, she knew it already had. If this story moved you, Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes grandmothers are true heroes. The rain fell heavily over Vancouver, Canada that night. Police lights flashed outside Margaret Thompson's small house on Maple Street, casting red and blue reflections across the windows. Inside the house, Margaret sat quietly on the couch. Her hands trembled slightly as she held a cup of tea she hadn't touched. Across from her sat two police officers. One of them, Officer Daniel Brooks, spoke gently. "Mrs. Thompson, we're going to do everything we can to investigate this." Margaret nodded slowly. "I just want my grandson safe." The officer gave her a reassuring look. "That's our priority too." But Margaret knew something deep inside. This nightmare wasn't over yet. Meanwhile, at Vancouver General Hospital, Ethan lay in his bed while doctors monitored his condition carefully. His father, Michael Walker, stood beside the window, staring into the dark city outside.
Ethan stepped out of the car slowly. Margaret held his hand tightly. The boy looked around with a wide smile. "I missed this place." Michael laughed softly. "We missed you too." Jessica hugged him tightly. For the first time in a long time, the family felt whole again. That evening, they all sat together in Margaret's living room, the same room where Ethan had once collapsed, the same room where everything had changed. But now, it felt warm again, safe. Ethan sat beside Margaret on the couch. "Grandma?" "Yes," he smiled. "You saved me." Margaret chuckled softly. "No, sweetheart." She tapped his chest gently. "You saved yourself." Ethan tilted his head. "How?" Margaret looked into his eyes. "By being brave enough to speak." Michael looked at his mother. "Mum." Margaret turned toward him. "I owe you an apology." Margaret frowned. "For what?" Michael sighed. "For not listening when you were worried." Jessica nodded too. "We should have trusted your instincts." Margaret smiled kindly. "What matters is that Ethan is safe." Michael stood up and hugged his mother tightly. "You're stronger than all of us." Margaret laughed softly. Grandmothers usually are. That night, Ethan sat beside Margaret at the kitchen table while she baked cookies. The smell of chocolate filled the house. "Grandma?" "Yes?" "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." Ethan smiled. "Why do grandmas always know when something is wrong?" Margaret thought for a moment. Then she answered gently. "Because our hearts have been listening longer." Ethan grinned. "That makes sense." But before this story ends, I want to tell you something important. Families are not perfect. Sometimes the people we trust the most can hurt us. Sometimes the quiet voices in the room know the truth before anyone else. And sometimes, the strongest hero in a family is not the loudest person. It's the one who refuses to ignore their heart. Just like Margaret Thompson, a grandmother who refused to stay silent. A grandmother who protected the child she loved. A grandmother who proved that love is stronger than fear. And Ethan, months later, he returned to school, healthy, happy, and stronger than ever. But every afternoon after school, he still runs to one special house on Maple Street. He bursts through the door shouting the same words. "Grandma, I'm here!" And Margaret always answers with a smile. "I've been waiting." Before this story ends, we have a small request for you. If this emotional story touched your heart, please like this video, please subscribe to our Grandma Stories channel, and share this story with someone who loves powerful family stories. Your support helps us continue telling stories that inspire, heal, and remind us how important family truly is. And remember, sometimes the greatest heroes are the grandmothers sitting quietly beside us.